Hello and welcome to the Slate Political Gabfest.
The president ran on the notion that the Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional. I agree with that.
January 30th, 2025, the Fork in the Road edition. I'm David Plotz of CityCast in Washington, D.C., where there's just a pall over the city after this horrific plane crash last night. From the New York Times Magazine and Yale University Law School, Emily Bazelon. How are you doing, Emily?
I'm okay. Good to see you guys.
And from New York City, John Dickerson, co-anchor of the CBS Evening News, just finishing up his first week in that job. Congratulations, John.
Thank you. It's good to see you guys.
Do you want to tell listeners, 10 seconds on how it's going?
It's going well. I think it's going well. People are getting what we're trying to do with the show. Not everyone. Some people want something else, which is fine for them. But it's going well. And it's great to work with a great group of people who are working super hard.
I will say, as somebody who doesn't regularly watch Evening News, and I obviously watched some of John this week, and this has got a lot of substance. If you like John Dickerson, if you like the kind of the meat on the bone of John Dickerson, you'll enjoy this because this is not quick and trashy. This is there's real depth in what they're doing. So, congratulations.
You couldn't have said anything that would have made me happier. So that's great to hear.
This week on the Gabfest, President Trump's sweeping efforts to stop federal spending, his freeze and unfreeze of federal grants and loans. We'll talk about the coming fight over impoundment. What is it? Is it legal? Can it be stopped? Then the sudden arrival of the cheap Chinese AI model DeepSeek. How will it upend tech and tech policy? Then we'll talk to my personal hero, Jonathan Rauch, about his new book exploring how Christianity has become a threat to American democracy. Plus, of course, we'll have cocktail chatter.
Every day, thousands of Comcast engineers and technologists, like Kunle, put people at the heart of everything they create.
In the average household, there are dozens of connected devices. Here in the Comcast family, we're building an integrated in-home Wi-Fi solution for millions of families like my own. It brings people together in meaningful ways.
Kunle and his team are building a Wi-Fi experience that connects 1 billion devices every year. Learn more about how Comcast is redefining the future of connectivity at comcastcorporation.com/Wi-Fi.
I'm sure this is true for you, that an hour is like a day in the Trump universe. A day is like a month, or a day is like a week, maybe, and a week is like a year. The Trumpian onslaught on the federal government went in all kinds of directions this week. The White House bent on bending the government to its will, quickly and brutally acted so fast. Either yesterday or maybe it was a month ago, Elon Musk sent out an email that encouraged it wasn't Elon Musk. It just clearly came from the desk of Elon Musk.
It was the same subject line as his firing or forced out email to all of Twitter.
Yes, that sent out an email saying to all federal employees that you can resign now and kind of get paid for 8 months, but maybe you still have to work anyway. Then the Trump Department of Justice fired perhaps illegally career prosecutors who worked on Jack Smith's investigation. Trump also fired, again, perhaps illegally, as many as 17 independent inspectors general. And most alarmingly, Trump's OMB froze all federal grants and loans for a moment to all billions and billions and billions of dollars that go to all kinds of things that the government supports indirectly and directly, and then suddenly rolled that back. So it is chaos. It is so much more radical and so much quicker than I think almost anyone expected. I imagine for the Trump folks, it is very quite thrilling. We could probably talk for hours about any of these topics, but let's focus on this freeze and unfreeze in federal payments. So, John, who was affected by this in the moments that it was in place? And how were they affected?
Can I add a question? Why did it fall apart so quickly?
I think it fell apart so quickly because there was chaos, pressure from the Hill from both parties who were getting flooded with calls from people trying to just figure out what the orders were here. I mean, first of all, broad sweeping memo goes out Monday night. unleashes massive confusion. First, kind of clarity was that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security direct payments were not going to be affected. There was a little side drama when a Medicaid portal went down for, I think it was Illinois. I'm not sure it was beyond that, which was a separate problem, but was conflated in this because it happened simultaneously, and therefore there was some thought that this order had frozen access to some of Medicaid. That was a side drama, but it was at one point mixed into the main drama about this overall freeze, and that matters because it gives you some sense of the just overall chaos. So then there was just such a backlash and so much confusion about it that they rescinded the freeze. But then the White House press secretary said, no, the freeze isn't rescinded. What I believe she meant is that the underlying executive order, the whole theory of the freeze was OMB is going to pause all of this to make sure that it aligns with the president's priorities. We'll get into the Impoundment Act of 1974. That is not one of the reasons for which you can pause federal executive branch spending. There are reasons you can pause it, but to align with the president's priorities is not one of the reasons. And the reason this is all important is that in a shared powered system, it's important to have input from the rest of the country on the spending decisions and priorities that a government makes on behalf of its people. And that is informed by all the representatives in the legislature, and they make these decisions. So it shouldn't be the fact that the entire country's fortunes rest in the will of one man. That's not the way the system was designed to be equitable. And so when you hijack the decisions of the legislature, that's what was essentially happening here.
Had this gone into effect for more than 24 hours, or even in the 24 hours, who is affected by this? Like when you freeze payments of grants and loans, what doesn't happen?
I mean, it was everything. It was like...
Yeah, the list went on forever.
Yeah, I mean, money to the police to help, fight drug crime, and nonprofits that serve people who do all kinds of things, and lots of other programs. Like, it was just... The specifics were so broad. It included relief from the storm disasters in North Carolina and other states. I mean, that was why the response was so overwhelming. And I think there was such utter disregard for the panic that this kind of order sows, and just the anxiety of uncertainty that it creates. I mean, I was really struck by that you're just like catching all these people off guard, making everyone scramble. And clearly, if you cared about that, you would never do something like this. At the same time, the backlash was swift and sure and huge, and it made a huge impact. I mean, they rescinded the order. So there was something about a kind of return to political reality here that, I think was also noteworthy.
The Times listed all of the federal programs that were affected by this order. The Budget Office actually named them, and the Times the list is 2,600 of them. So that gives you some sense of the massive, overwhelming scope of this. Some would include Meals on Wheels, housing assistance programs for low-income families, Head Start, Native American tribal nation money that goes to tribal nations, medical research, Pell Grants. And it wasn't everybody, because the list was so huge, everybody just assumed they were on the list. And they were basically treated when people were confused. The White House press secretary told our Nancy Cordes, who said, well, how do people figure out what's going on? And they said, well, we talked to the incoming OMB director. Russell Vought said, well, give out his number and people can call him, which is the kind of answer you give when you have no interest in actually helping people who are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary thing. And you do have to ask yourself, is the uncertainty and the fear the point? Or was it really an accidental, incidental, inadvertent side product of they're just really trying to go after woke and DEI programs, and they just went too broad because they don't know what the heck they're doing? Or is it intentional to create all this fear in the people who use federal government money for things? Because clearly it's intentional to create fear in federal employees. Like, that's obviously a program that is clear, sharply well-defined and underway right now. And so is it also designed to create fear in people who are federal grantees and loanees? I don't know.
I kind of think they screwed up, but I also think it doesn't really matter because it has all of those effects and just it was just kind of breathtaking to think, and it's illegal, which we should get to.
Yeah.
But
False choice also, by the way. Like, it can be both. Like, it has the benefit of being both. I mean, I think this is, so we can put this under the heading of shock and awe. We can put this under the larger project of, or the larger modus operandi of move fast and break stuff. In other words, Trump was the one who said, I'm not going to vet nominees. I'll just pick them, throw them out there. And in the maelstrom, if they make it through, great. If they don't, but most of them will make it through. And that's the way policymaking is being done. I mean, the whole idea that nothing coming from the executive branch should go out into the world without being checked and verified across all departments, which was the norm with chiefs of staff up until this point, that's out the window. The reason that was the norm, by the way, of course, we should remind, is just it didn't waste time. It didn't sap morale. And it didn't create chaos and disruption which distracts you from all the other stuff you should be doing. Nevertheless, I think this is part of the larger project. And one other tiny thing I would say is that Trump is trying to argue with House Republicans, you need to create a blueprint for spending in reconciliation and some other things that has my priorities in it. Those priorities are massive budget busters, tax cuts, lots of spending for immigration.
Mission to Mars.
And so you could imagine him saying, hey, I know you don't, I know you're going to want lots of spending restraint. Look at all the spending restraint I'm exercising over here in the executive branch. So please support my priorities and don't block me with your tiny majority in the House.
I'm reminded of this. This is an analogy that won't quite work, and I've used it before in the Gabfest. There, in biology and evolutionary biology, there's this concept of the R strategy and the K strategy. And the R strategy, I think, is you have tons and tons and tons and tons of offspring. You kind of don't take care of them. You let them just like fight it out, survive, eat each other, get eaten by their, neighbors, and a few of them make it through. But by just like having tons of them, you make it more likely that a few are going to get through. And then there are K strategies, which is what humans are, which is you just have very few offspring. You invest a huge amount of energy and time into gestating them and to raising them, and you make it, they overwhelmingly will survive. And K strategies are all built around love and community and society and close connections. And our strategies are the opposite. It's like every person for themselves. There's no order. And whenever I see Trump operating, I'm always like, this is like what, if there is an R strategy for government, this is what the man represents. It's like, doesn't matter. Consequence that can happen over there. Don't really care. We're just throwing everything out there.
I find that a very persuasive way of thinking about events. We should just historical before we get to the legal. This is a fight that happened during the Nixon era where he sought impoundment power, and Congress, as a part of the general restraint of the imperial presidency, responded with the Impoundment Act that should now constrain the Trump administration.
Yeah. So let's talk about this word. So this is a word that I think most people have never heard, except maybe when some ne'er-do-well cousin's car got taken off the street.
Although we've mentioned it several times during the election on the Gabfest.
They may have heard it in the last, recent.
But otherwise, the impoundment law, is this where government spending goes, to the impoundment law? So, Emily, what is impoundment, and what have Trump's people said about impoundment? And is there any wiggle room in what the law is, even with this Supreme Court?
Impoundment is the president deciding not to spend money that Congress has authorized. And of course, this is like the most basic question of congressional power and the way the branches operate. When Congress appropriates funds, that's the power of the purse. And it is then the executive's job to figure out how to spend the money. And yes, of course, there's wiggle room. There has to be wiggle room, right? Like if you think about this historically, there have been lots of moments in which Congress has authorized more money than seemed wise to spend in exactly the way Congress said. And so over the course of history, American presidents have sometimes not spent all the money. But when the reason for not spending the money is political and based on an agenda, as opposed to something that's like just being prudent and shrewd and kind of economizing, then you have a real question about the different powers of the branches. And so when there was this fight because Nixon was doing something akin to what Trump is doing now, Congress passed a law in 1974 with a lot of specifics about how exactly the president can decide not to spend money. And there is a provision in it for deferrals, where you can stop for a short amount of time. You can tell Congress what you're doing and have a discussion. Then there's this idea of rescission. You can say, I'm not going to spend this money for 45 days. But again, you have to go back to Congress. And what is supposed to be at issue here are not political considerations. So what was striking from a legal point of view is that the Trump people didn't try to say, here are perfectly valid, legal, unpolitical rationales for doing this. They said, we are worried about like wokeism and Marxism in the federal government and the Green New Deal. And so if they were setting up a test case for a clash with the Impoundment Act, it was really challenging whether Congress had the power to limit the president in this way. That was quite striking. And even though this particular order has been rescinded, one imagines that there are going to be other kinds of challenges like this, because Trump seems to be itching for this kind of fight with Congress about Congress's powers. And it just seems super obvious and in line with previous Supreme Court cases that absolutely Congress should be able to tie the president's hands once Congress has authorized an appropriation of funds, because otherwise, all the bargaining that goes into the legislative process, all the compromises that people make to hammer out spending agreements become meaningless.
Do you guys think basically that the reaction here is, oh, this is a surprise? Or is it, well, he did run on all this, except I think this is essentially Project 2025 come to life, and he didn't run on that. He explicitly ran away from that and said that wasn't his project. But it seems to me that what we are in another situation where people, he was pretty open about all of this. And by this, I'm talking not just about impoundment, but I think all the moves of retribution, which we should maybe also quickly go through it, just firing of the IGs and the career people inside the Justice Department who investigated him, removing security clearances from Pompeo, Milley, John Bolton, the series of retributory acts that he's taking. It seems like all of this is basically what he ran on and what people voted for.
Yeah.
Right. But that doesn't make it constitutional.
Oh, God, no. No, 100%. It's democracy working, even though it may not be constitutional.
Well, something's working. So I think, Emily, can we just dig into the legal aspect of this? So as you say, it is incredibly destructive of politics to do this because deal making is meaningless. And so whatever compromises you make to get what you want in a bill, you no longer can trust that they'll be carried out, and so you won't make those deals. And so you're negotiating with someone in bad faith. And I think everyone talks about how Trump is somebody as a real estate person who always acted in bad faith, and you couldn't trust anything he said when he was in real estate. And so it's not kind of surprising that he wants to do the same thing. What I wonder is, it seems likely there will be some litigation about this. Something will get up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court will basically say you have to spend money. The Supreme Court, I don't see John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett saying, oh, the president doesn't have to spend money if he doesn't want to. I think they will probably uphold impoundment. My question to you, Emily, is what if the president just doesn't go along with it? Like, what if the president just is ignores it? Or also the other option I was thinking of is malicious compliance, a phrase I just learned this week. What if he just spends the money, but hires intentionally incompetent people to do the work poorly?
That would be a time-honored way of having this work out, right? I don't think we have any protection against that kind of stonewalling in spending the money. John, are you disagreeing?
No, I'm saying, it seems to be, whether by intent or the result of his Office of Personnel Management approach, which is just get rid of people. And that's why the Twitter analogy struck me, which is Elon Musk, Twitter is working for the way he wants it to work. It ain't what it used to be. And what if you map that onto the federal government, it will come to work for the project that Donald Trump wants, which is very different than the project that it was initially instituted for.
Right. And I think also worth noting, when former President Biden came into office, Congress had appropriated a lot of money to build a border wall. Biden didn't want to do that. He didn't come out and announce, like, I am against the border wall. That is my reason for not spending this money. But they tied it up in lots of regulatory review, and they didn't really spend the money in the timely way they were supposed to. That was, and the GAO ruled that was legal in a way that they had ruled against the Trump administration, which was more overt in its political considerations. And this is the first Trump administration I'm talking about. So there are plenty of ways that the federal government can gum up the works if it chooses. I also think it's worth thinking about a kind of underlying frustration or tension in American government. So if you go back to the debates over the line item veto, right, whether the president can cross things out of a giant budget appropriation from Congress, it's the same thing, right? It's this sort of frustration, this idea that these omnibus bills pass and lots of stuff gets written into fine print, funding all kinds of things. And yes, it's the democratic process, but also it's such an enormous vehicle that care is not being taken in how taxpayer dollars are really being spent. And lots of things are getting squirreled in. Yeah, it is true. And so that's what led to this idea. Well, the president should be able to cross things out at the end and kind of have this red pen. And the Supreme Court said, no, you said, like, that's not going to work that way. And I think this picking up this tool of impoundment is the precise same instinct. And I also think it is unconstitutional and, like, clearly illegal. At the same time, and I don't want to associate myself with, like, the Trumpian rationale for this, but this problem of government spending and of sludge within the government is a real problem. It's just that the people who are trying to solve it right now are just, like, breaking everything along the way.
Right. Two things can be true. There can be a real problem, and this solution is not the solution to it. But as a political matter, what you put your finger on, Emily, is undoubtedly what gives the president more latitude. I mean, in other words, people who are not following this at the minute detail level would be like, sounds about right. Congress is wasting money, wasting time. What do? They go on my TV and say meaningless things all the time. What a great thing that he's shaking them up and not following every dumb decision they made. And pork barrel spending, which is not necessarily connected to this, but is a thing in the lexicon and in the world, is, something people would be fine to get rid of if somebody came in there with a with a daddy's home approach. So I think he probably has latitude to do a lot of this stuff. It just isn't the way the system is supposed to work for good reasons.
It also relates, though, to these questions about, offering this buyout, whether it's real or not, to these 2 million workers and even firing the inspectors general. Like, it seems incredibly careless and heedless and, like, the wrong way to go about it. And yet at the same time, are people going to respond in the way you just suggested, John? Because there is this frustration. Like, how do you harness the good government reform energy without falling into this trap?
Yes. I mean, they don't have good government reform energy. They have some other form of energy.
They have "we hate you all" energy. Really.
Yeah.
But also, we've had this in many conversations on this show, which is, particularly in things where the Supreme Court has sent an issue back to Congress, it's often been the position that basically that means they've killed it, because anything you send to Congress to be adjudicated that has any complexity at all will either die or the outcome will be worse. And so I think the public pretty much feels that way.
This is where Trump does so well. In fact, our guest coming on later, Jonathan Rauch, has written so eloquently about this. People want someone who will do something, and Congress is a creature that is unable to act anymore and has chosen to become an institution that won't act anymore, and therefore, and the courts cannot proactively act; they can reactively act, and so you're left with a super empowered executive branch. And what does a super empowered executive person who has that instinct do? They go forth and do whatever the hell they want. And actually, that gets to my final question on this, Emily, which you ducked when I asked about the Impoundment Act, but I'll ask about the IGs and the Jack Smith prosecutors. It seems pretty clear that firing of the inspectors general was done illegally, in the sense there was no notice to Congress. It seems pretty clear that if Jack Smith prosecutors, who are career prosecutors, were fired, that was illegal. But what's going to happen with all these illegal acts if they're not all going to be litigated up to the Supreme Court even if the Supreme Court rules against the Trump administration and something like this, what actually happens? Because they may not comply.
Well, if the Trump administration defies a direct court order, we are in a break the glass moment. And I hope that we muster the real sense of drama that we should have about that, because that is going to be a really big deal. And I don't say that as like a big fan of the Supreme Court, but courts saying something is illegal and the other branches of government respecting that judgment is like a very core part of, I think, pretty much every successful constitutional democracy has an independent judiciary. So that idea of judicial review should remain crucial to our system, and we should all watch out for it. I think another cut at what you're asking is that there are various ways in which Congress has tried to insulate people in the executive branch from being fired willy-nilly by the president. And people who believe in unitary executive theory, which is this very like sweeping theory of presidential power, think it's crucial for the president to be able to fire every single person in the executive branch when he or she feels like it. So, take the inspectors general. Yes, Congress passed a statute saying there has to be 30 days of notice to Congress and you have to explain in writing what you're doing. And the Trump people didn't bother with that. So that's like a clear violation of that law. And if one of the IGs challenges it, they should win. And then what? I don't know. Maybe the Trump people just do it over again and they give the notice. But I do think they are very interested in challenging whether that law comports with the Supreme Court's conception of executive power. And I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to say. And you can ask this question about protections people have who serve on the EOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or the NLRB, the National Labor Relations Board. There's a series of firings going on that are all about challenging this idea that there are certain parts of the government that are better off operating somewhat insulated from direct presidential intervention. And, I think that's been an important part of the system because it makes it more expert and less partisan and hopefully just like more neutral and fair. But I think that we are going to see some serious challenges, and it's hard to know exactly what the Supreme Court's going to say.
Picking up on that, your one thing to watch for is the clash between the Fed and Donald Trump. The Fed held rates steady after cutting them last 3 times, and because they see inflation both in the world, but also I think part of their thinking based on the minutes is that they see inflation in future Trump policies. Trump is actively saying he's attacking Powell and the Fed, saying they should be cutting rates. Cutting rates at the wrong time makes inflation worse. And so you have this, many economists are thanking God that there is this wall that you just described, Emily, between the independent Fed and a president. But we'll see how long that lasts and if that norm holds. And then 2 final points. One, when we're talking about this, what's the political downside of this 4-step failure on freezing federal funds is, I wonder, a term came to mind. Remember Ahmad Chalabi and the Iraq War when he said we were heroes in error, which was his way of discussing the fact that the war had gone awfully, but that they had the right intentions. I think that Trump probably, it looks shambolic, but like the goal, which is getting a hold of wasteful spending, probably doesn't mean that this ends up being a huge downside. And the final point is what is going to be worth watching for is Gautam Mukunda's theory about the presidency, which I think is true of executive branches too. Let's say you get rid of all these people and these programs and all this stuff, and that's your project and that's why you were elected. But the government is like an airbag, like you need it when you need it. And there will be a thing, and we thought this was the case with COVID-19, and it was, when you atrophy or ignore the things that government has been tasked with paying attention to over time, that can lead to massive downside results.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Lewis wrote a whole book about this, The Fifth Risk, which is what happens when you take expertise and experience out of the government when it comes to these things that have black swan or catastrophic downsides. Although I think a lot of people would argue that, the vaccine program aside, which is arguably not even the federal government, except in money, that the federal government did not cover itself in huge amounts of glory during COVID.
That's the problem, right? Is that if you think that already happened, that they already blew it, and you're already mad at them, then you think the hell with this.
Well, but yes, but you
could have been worse.
Twofer. You have one, which is people would say, yeah, but that's because, as the experts who looked at the period of COVID under Trump said, he was a comorbidity, which is to say, the bureaucracy can only do so much when the executive doesn't want to listen to them. However, as David pointed out during the election, an overwhelming recollection of COVID-19 that people have is what happened in the schools. And that's not so much a Trump blame thing, but a sort of Democrats, Biden, the left thing. So that shapes public opinion about this as well.
And we'll talk about that in our Slate Plus episode. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Home Chef. So the other night, I cooked an amazing meal from Home Chef, or rather, my son cooked an amazing meal from Home Chef. We had garlic ginger tofu tacos with teriyaki glaze and pineapple salsa. I had this wonderful Home Chef delivery, and I was busy, and I just said, Gideon, who's 16 years old, can you just deal with this? And Gideon, who's smart but doesn't cook a lot, pulled this meal together. It was fantastic. First of all, he had a blast doing it. Instructions were clear as a bell. He understood exactly what he needed to do. He had fun making it. And also, I didn't have to deal with making dinner, which is what I usually have to deal with. And it was delicious. The tacos were wonderful. We devoured it. Home Chef delivers fresh ingredients and chef design recipes to your doorstep. And users of leading meal kits, including Gideon, apparently, my son, have rated Home Chef #1 in quality, convenience, value, taste, and recipe ease. For a limited time, Home Chef is offering Political Gabfest listeners 18 free meals plus free dessert for life and, of course, free shipping on your first box. Go to homechef.com/Gabfest. That's homechef.com/Gabfest for 18 free meals and free dessert for life. Homechef.com/Gabfest. Must be an active subscriber to receive free dessert. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by Found. When you're a small business owner, having your bookkeeping and taxes in order comes at a cost. It's not only your money, it's also your time, hours and hours that you could have spent actually growing your business. But guess what? It does not have to be that way, thanks to Found. Found is a banking platform that doesn't merely consolidate your financial ecosystem. It automates manual activities like expense tracking and finding tax write-offs. And it makes staying on top of invoices and payments incredibly easy. That's why small businesses are loving Found. This Found user said, Found is going to save me so much headache. It makes everything so much easier. Expenses, income, profits, taxes, invoices even. And Found has 30,000 5-star reviews just like this. Don't put this one off. Join thousands of small business owners who've streamlined their finances with Found. Open a Found account for free at found.com/Gabfest. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC. Decisions made in Washington affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including the policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation fears, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen. DeepSeek, a Chinese AI model, I should say DeepSeek V3, a Chinese AI model built by a fintech entrepreneur, has shaken the entire tech world. Tech stocks lost $1 trillion in market value in a day. Early in the week, NVIDIA alone losing $600 billion in a day when word sort of continued to come. The DeepSeek V3 matched the performance of the GPT products, but was developed at a fraction of the cost with only a handful of chips. And none of those chips were the highest end ones that Google and Microsoft and Amazon and Meta are buying from NVIDIA for their AI ventures. These are chips that are under strict export controls. The DeepSeek bombshell called all kinds of things into question at once. Are are export controls effective? Has the U.S. reliance on a few big tech companies frozen out clever small entrepreneurs like DeepSeek? Has China's engineering prowess surpassed ours? And also, did this even happen? There's a very credible case that the basic argument of DeepSeek, which is we only used a few tiny old chips, is not even true. That they in fact have a cache of high end chips that were stolen out of the U.S. or sneaked out of the U.S. That they used to build their model and test their model. So, John, I'm interested in this. Last month, there were lots of complaints that like big tech AI would be energy hogging, put too much power into the control of a few companies. Now it looks like there's real competition in price and functionality, a huge reduction in energy consumption. Isn't this like overwhelmingly good news for the world, except for some invidious shareholders? Isn't this great?
I think that's what's being said. That's what's shaken out since the first day when there was the panic. There are people who have come to the view that this is great, lower cost and faster, more nimble and efficient ways of getting to a large language model result is wonderful, because for all kinds of different reasons, including medium-sized companies can access this technology and put it to good use with their data set, whatever that may be, in a way that they might have been priced out before. So I think there's some of that. Some of that might be actually true. I think the market panic might have been what you were talking about earlier, which is not so much a normative question. It's just a kind of like, oh, damn, we picked the wrong playbook. Now, I would add to your point about the possibly sneaky chips being there's a second question about whether DeepSeek used the distillation.
H800. Oh, go ahead.
Well, there's the H800. Yeah, that's interesting because
What?
Well, the H800 is, I believe, check me if I'm wrong here, David. It's basically the lower power chip that DeepSeek had to use, and what that caused it to do was come up with two possible innovations. And I could be wholly out of my depth here, but one is to use what's called a mixture of experts way of solving problems, which is basically feels like, as I read about it, sort of load sharing, which is different than the way other AI large language models do their processing. It costs less. And the other is the way in which memory was used because of the limitations that were put on by export controls. Memory was used in a more efficient way that's not as expensive. I think that's roughly right. But what I was talking about is this thing called distillation, which is whereby, as I understand it, artificial intelligence trains itself on itself. And that basically there is the allegation from OpenAI is that DeepSeek trained itself on the responses from OpenAI's ChatGPT.
And Meta.
Essentially, and Meta, okay. And so that basically it stole... I mean, basically, if you think of it, a weightlifter getting really strong, but OpenAI paid for the weights. And that cost, turns out, a boatload of money. So that some of this is all being figured out.
And can I just say that some of us are not crying for OpenAI and Meta because our IP is constantly getting stolen and vacuumed up by these companies. So there's this, irony that they're complaining that their terms of service may have been violated when there also are these big lawsuits, including one, I should say, from the New York Times about how they deal with other people's intellectual property. So there's a kind of hoisting on one's own petard going on here. Can I ask another question? I mean, this question of whether this is good or bad, let 1,000 AI flowers bloom, as the Wall Street Journal editorial page put it. I mean, it seems great if you think that AI is going to be good for the world. If you think that, artificial general intelligence, this idea of like they're going to think as well or better than us and maybe take over, could lead to the end of humankind or just a lot of suffering, then this seems alarming, even while one is cackling at the big tech companies for perhaps having the wrong ideas.
Yeah, I guess so. So you have this ranking of things that you wish to happen. One is you don't wish the world to be destroyed.
Right.
Another is you wish to smash the oligarchic power of big tech and anything that makes Meta and Apple and Amazon and Nvidia and Microsoft and Google a little bit weaker, but especially Meta is like, that seems pretty good.
Yeah, I'm caught.
Yeah. And also, like, is it inexorable anyway? And so if it's inexorable anyway, do we want it to be inexorable from a kind of bottom up, more grassroots, smaller companies version of it? Or do we want it to come from these big guys who are maybe more corporately responsible? That they may, if artificial general intelligence is coming for us, would we rather it be in the hands of Meta or in 100 entrepreneurs all over the world? And there could be an argument that it should be in the hands of Meta, because at least with Meta, it's only one institution that needs to corral it.
And then there's our competition with China, right? And how this factors into people's thinking. Like, if it's inexorable, what's the point of keeping the chips out of the hands of these Chinese companies? They're going to censor the answers you get from AI when you ask about Tiananmen Square, but like maybe that's just how it goes. Or is that a completely wrong-headed way to think about this? Because we should still try to have some emergency regulations that really address the safety issues here.
And I know you were trying to frame the choices quickly, David, but obviously there are people for whom the idea of having anything this large and powerful in the hand of one company, particularly Meta, would be so chilling that they couldn't get out of bed in the morning because of Meta's past choices, and particularly Mark Zuckerberg's transactional and general approach to the world. Just to your earlier point,
and also, and actually, sorry to interrupt you, John, because you're going to another point, but also I would argue that it is truly an open question whether artificial general intelligence or artificial intelligence broadly is going to be a boon or a danger to the world. I think there are lots of people who think this is going to be a huge boon. It's going to help us mitigate suffering and disease and take a lot of the drudgery of life away from human beings and put it on computer chips. And those people may be right. So it's also not definitively, if artificial general intelligence comes, we are screwed and life will become miserable.
Yeah, we just have no idea, truly.
Although I think we do know as a matter of human nature that even the utopian vision of AI where it does all this stuff for us, our expectations just change, and that we find and so the measurement of what makes us happy and miserable shifts. So it's not like we get to it's not like things get solved and we're like, we are
exactly
psyched and done. No, it never works out that way.
I totally agree with that. And that's why I'm so skeptical of this. And what I personally, and this is just very self-involved, but forgive me, I keep hoping that this is all going to happen at a time when I am too old to have to really figure it out. And now my children inform me nope, mom, you're going to be dragged kicking and screaming into this era because it's upon us rapidly. David remains skeptical.
We're already too old. We don't need to worry about this stuff.
No, man.
That.
No, it's because it's going to increase longevity of life, and therefore it's going to keep you alive.
God, I hope not.
Suffer through it. But
can you imagine 117-year-old Emily Bazelon nattering on?
Agree.
I would delight in that. But to your very first point, David, I just found in the research this quote from Satya Nadella, Microsoft CEO, who said, "As AI gets more efficient and accessible, we will see its use skyrocket, turning it into a commodity we just can't get enough of." That was his response on X, which he may be whistling past the graveyard, although I think both Meta and Microsoft, subsequent to this earthquake, which, by the way, has been going on since Christmas in some quarters. I think it just publicly burst out this week. But they basically said, we're keeping all of our bets on AI. And there seems to be some recovery going on from the Monday panic about this. And we should name for people what the actual panic is, which was basically the idea that the only way you could get to artificial general intelligence and AI dominance was through the massive amounts of spending on chips for memory and compute power and servers to manage all this stuff and energy to cool it all and water to keep it cool. And that idea of massive capital investment being the only way to get to victory has been undermined by this. Is that essentially it?
Yeah.
And that being first might mean that everyone else just piggybacks off of all of the weightlifting that you were doing and the weights that you paid for.
Yeah. And so this also affects sort of the political dynamics around the CHIPS Act, all the spending to build new chip manufacturing capacity. Is that a wise investment?
What I imagine, I'll try and do this quickly, is that every one of the American high-tech companies will now go to the FTC and Congress and say, hey, guys, this is how fragile life is in the high-tech world. There's no such thing as a monopoly. You can have your lunch stolen in an instant. See what happened with DeepSeek. Even if the true lesson of DeepSeek in the end is, and I have no proof of this, but even if the lesson in the end is actually they stole it, they used chips that were much more powerful than they said, and it's a total fraud, Nevertheless, the memory of what happened Monday will be used to basically say we need no regulations, no hindrance, because life can change for us in an instant, and therefore there is competition and monopolies don't exist.
Right. Two quick final points. One, just to explain what we mean by the chips being stolen. The Wall Street Journal did some investigation, and it appears that the highest end NVIDIA chips are being taken out of the United States to China a few at a time, that people are buying them, they're managing to get hold of a few, and then they're putting them in luggage and suitcase and then flying to China and giving them to Chinese companies. And so the idea that there's an export control that is fully preventing those chips from leaving the US seems to be not true. The sieve it's a sieve, not a airtight bag, and therefore the DeepSeek, the company that built DeepSeek, may have acquired up to 50,000 of these chips, which is
a lot of luggage.
What some people are saying. Second thing I want to note is I just want to spend a second just paying tribute to the work that must have gone into this, because it sounds like they did something extraordinary quickly with no kind of help from some big company outside. This was all Chinese engineers, Chinese trained engineers. And it must have been a really special workplace. It must be a really special workplace.
CBS went to visit there in Hong Kong, and there were robots cleaning the floor of the lobby of the building, and they were kicked out. But it looked, from the images, it did not look like a bulking, a behemoth. It sort of kind of matched the feeling of this.
But it's probably a small team working really well together that were really motivated and were so excited to solve this problem. And that's what tends to make great things happen. This episode of the Gabfest is sponsored by BetterHelp. Life isn't about resolutions that fade by the beginning of February. It's about picking up the pen and becoming the author of your own life. And therapy can help you write new chapters and create the meaningful story you deserve to live. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is fully online, making therapy more accessible, affordable, and convenient. BetterHelp has a diverse network of more than 30,000 credentialed therapists with a wide range of specialties. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. And if you feel like your matched therapist isn't the right one for you, you can easily switch therapists anytime at no extra cost. Write your story with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/Gabfest today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Gabfest. Support for the Gabfest comes from USA for UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency. People facing war and violence are now facing winter far from home in temporary shelters with little to keep them warm. As humanitarian needs in Ukraine, Afghanistan, Syria, and beyond increase, ensuring continued funding to help the most vulnerable is more urgent than ever. You can help. Donate today to help keep families safe and warm this winter. UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, works around the clock to support the most vulnerable throughout the year, providing blankets, cash to buy warm clothes, fuel for heaters, and shelter. It's during the winter months that your support makes all the difference. Help protect refugees and people forced to flee as they faced winter far from home. Your gift is matched for a limited time. Give now at unrefugees.org/winter. If I could pick one writer to explain what has happened in America over the past generation, it would be Jonathan Rauch, a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. John has been studying and explaining the crisis in American democracy and politics for as long as I've been, for a generation, more than a generation, prophesying Trumpism before Trump. He has a new book, Cross Purposes, Christianity's Broken Bargain with Democracy, that builds on a series of lectures he gave at Johns University of Virginia. Cross Purposes tries to explain why the bond that held Christianity and liberal democracy together has broken, why there's been such a rise of an authoritarian, catastrophist, cruel Christianity in its place, and how that threatens the United States' very survival as a democratic republic, and how we can get ourselves out of it by looking to Utah, apparently. So, John Rauch, welcome to the Gabfest. It's good to have you back on after many years, although we do talk about you all the time.
Thank you. I love to be here.
So I want to start in the middle. What is the Church of Fear, and how has it come to dominate the public face of Christianity in the U.S.?
This is a view of Christianity which is partisan, political, and apocalyptic. It says that Christians, specifically white Protestants and evangelicals, are losing their place in the world and society, that Christianity is in danger, and that our country is being taken over by the left, and that Christianity needs to fight back. Enough with the turn the other cheek nonsense.
Talk us through also your idea of thin Christianity, which is about the kind of mainline Protestant churches that are not taking the extreme views you were just laying out, but in your view are also in some ways failing their constituents or failing the democracy.
So the overriding concept here is the secularization of Christianity in America, meaning it becomes less and less like the countercultural religion that focuses on preparing us for the next world and more like just part of the larger culture. And for white evangelicals, that's taken the form we just discussed, which is apocalyptic partisanship. For the mainline churches, the ecumenical churches, the United Methodists and Episcopalians and so forth, they went through a wave of secularization a generation and two earlier, but the form they took wasn't becoming politicized and apocalyptic. It was just sort of blending into the general culture. They kind of lost their anchoring in the Bible, and they stopped really requiring much of their members or offering much in return. And they stopped being countercultural, and so people drifted off. That's what I mean when I call them thin.
What role does apocalypse play, and how tailor-made is that for this political moment? And do you see it mapping conveniently on even secular responses to the culture war, but with the theological boost behind it really is perfect for a certain kind of thinking that is not religious, but that is more towards basically power aims of a particular party or ideology?
The MAGA movement's explicit promise to white evangelicals, something Trump has said again and again. He said it in 2016 in his campaign. He said it again in 2024, is if I'm elected, you will have power. You will have more power than you have ever had before. Christians, white evangelicals, justify this by saying they need power in order to project Christianity. But of course, Jesus' doctrine is not about power. It is about the opposite of power. It is about the least of these. So the gospel of power has seeped into the church and become a factor that many Christians believe has corrupted it. But that's less of a matter of doctrine than it just is the culture and politics corrupting Christianity.
Can I follow up on that, guys? Just as a Christian, John,
as the Christian,
I should say I'm not one. I'm a gay atheistic Jew, so I'm the outsider. I'm the pretender.
Jonathan,
I don't think being gay this doesn't matter in this context.
Oh well, some people think it does. Believe me,
some people think it does.
Yeah.
But, Jonathan, did you read the New Testament? Because as a Christian who reads the Bible, you can't get away from Jesus's message being exactly the opposite of the power argument you were making. And I just wondered if that was a part of your research and if that struck you as well.
Well, I wish I'd spoken to you because I should have reread the New Testament or the Christian Bible, as we Jews call it. And I did not, but I consulted with theologians and Christians, and they agree that there are three tenets that really define Christianity, if you had to define it standing on one leg. The first is don't be afraid, the most frequently repeated injunction in the Christian Bible. Number two, imitate Jesus, that is, be egalitarian and consider the least of these. And the third is forgive each other. And those map very well onto the core teachings of Madisonian liberal pluralism. Be not afraid means be willing to lose an election. Don't panic. Be like Jesus means look out for minority communities, the marginalized, and treat everyone as an end in themselves, not a means to an end. Be an egalitarian. And Forgive each other translates into forbearance. When you win an election, don't try to crush the other side. Treat them with all the decency and respect that includes them in the country as you will want them to do when they win. You do not see much of that spirit of those three things in modern white evangelicalism, and Christians say that is the core of the crisis. They have abandoned Jesus for MAGA. Jesus is a lot more like Madison than he is like MAGA.
One of the things I think you point out so well in Cross Purposes is this sense of victimization. So Christians also feel they need to take power, not just to project Christianity, but they say to protect themselves from a war against them. Like they don't articulate it necessarily as we need to dominate everybody else. It's like, oh, we're being oppressed, and so we need to get power so we stop being oppressed. And this sense of victimization you talk about, how it is so out of whack with reality that there's never been a country in history or time more favorable to Christians than the United States at this moment. Sharp Christians have made this choice to be cruel, to align themselves with authoritarianism, to align themselves with masculinity, and have rejected these Christian values. And you paint that as an active choice. They actively went and sought it. They didn't have to go there. Why did they do that?
Fear, cultural fear, demographic fear. White evangelical church is collapsing at an unprecedented rate. We've never seen in America anything like the rate of de-churching that's happened in just the last 20 years. And 40 million people have gone from church attending to never attending. Church membership, which was 70% throughout the entire 20th century, through the whole period since polling began in the 40s, is now under half. People are fleeing the church, I think, a lot of Christians think, because of the bad decisions it is making to embrace politics and become culture war instead of countercultural. So they are letting that fear of losing their place in society infect the church, and it is shrinking the church and leading to a downward spiral.
So it's this interesting paradox, which is that you have a church which is numerically weaker, numerically fewer and fewer people, or smaller and smaller percentage of the population. And yet, when you look at this new Trump presidency and you look at the Republican Party, this Christianity is absolutely the dominant force guiding it.
Well, pseudo-Christianity, right? Christian nationalism and its offshoots, they're hard to define, but the one thing that scholars agree on who look at it is it's not Christian. It's pseudo-Christianity. It's a political ideology that adopts some of the symbolism and rhetoric of claiming to be Christian. But, there is nothing very Christian about Donald Trump Jr.'s famous speech. And when he says, I understand this stuff about turn the other cheek, but that's gotten us nothing.
We better be playing the same game. Okay? We've been playing T-ball for half a century, while they're playing hardball and cheating. Right? We've turned the other cheek, and I understand sort of the biblical reference. I understand the mentality, but it's gotten us nothing. Okay? It's gotten us nothing. While we've ceded ground in every major institution in our country.
Well, a guy died on a cross, right? He got nothing. What a sucker. This is not Christianity.
After his inauguration, President Trump went to prayer services at the National Cathedral in Washington, and the bishop there, Marianne Budde, got lots of press for making a kind of sober appeal to Trump to think about the weak and the vulnerable, and I think really to put the kind of principles of Jesus that you're talking about first in his presidency. What did you think about that intervention on her part?
I thought it's fine. I mean, I'm not a Christian. It's not my place to say, but I heard people say this was a radical, woke, socialistic minister bringing inappropriate politics in. And I looked at it, and it seemed like very much the equivalent of if a Catholic bishop had given a sermon saying, and Mr. President, please don't forget the hundreds of thousands of children who suffer and die every year as a result of abortion. I think she's perfectly entitled to make those points, and I welcome that kind of rhetoric. It's the sharp kind that brings partisan politics into the pulpit that is becoming more worrisome.
And just to remind listeners that, I mean, the idea of what would Jesus do as the central guiding principle of your life was once it had a fair amount of currency. People used to wear bracelets and seek that as the guiding force for the way they spent their days. So, and I guess what I mean is in some evangelical churches, that was very much the guiding view. But that was some number of years ago. Jonathan, are there individual Christian denominations that have a better relationship with what you're talking about than the groups you've been talking about?
The most interesting
spoiler alert.
the most interesting and countercultural church right now in this space by far is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, full disclosure, there is a dispute in Christian land about whether they're Christians or not, but they say they are, and their iconography is just covered with images of Jesus, though not crosses, which is kind of interesting. But they are similar demographically and politically to white evangelicals. They're conservative and Republican-leaning, and in America, predominantly white. And yet they are making the opposite choice from apocalyptic fear and cultural confrontation. They have developed a theology of what they call patience, negotiation, and mutual accommodation. They call it peacemaking. But it's really a theology about how to approach the whole civic and political sphere. And they say that their job is peacemaking, that they want to use their influence to increase the space for constructive resolution of arguments and decrease conflict. And they're not just talking the talk, they're walking the walk. They, as a church, oppose same-sex marriage. Homosexuality is a sin. Yet they joined a coalition that pushed through the Respect for Marriage Act, which enshrines my same-sex marriage in federal law and includes a package of religious liberty guarantees for churches like themselves. And I will have to tell you, that is not only profoundly countercultural at a time when other white conservative churches are sharpening their differences with democracy. I'm personally grateful for it. That's my marriage we're talking about.
I love your chapter on the LDS Church. It's really interesting. It's the last chapter in the book. I want to close with a paradox that you point out, and I think David French has also talked a lot about with alarm and puzzlement, is the tendency of so many people who are publicly Christian to be known as people who are quite decent in private, who are kind to friends and colleagues, perhaps noted, do forms of public service and help others out, and yet are cruel in public. Why is that happening? Why do people feel that it is perfectly okay to be cruel in public and yet would not, and yet in their own homes and in their own communities are the opposite?
The failing here that lies behind and under so much else is the absence in modern Christianity in America of a civic theology. So they have this term spiritual formation, or a synonym discipleship, which is the process of making oneself in the image of Jesus in word and deed. And the churches still do what we're talking here again about white Protestant evangelicals. The churches here do a pretty good job of discipling their members in their personal and community lives, the family, the church, and they're there when the hurricane strikes and the homes need to be rebuilt. But there's just a big void, a howling void in the space of how would Jesus want us Christians to behave toward each other in public spaces, civic spaces like social media and politics. That space has not been filled. Churches have been silent on that. And as a result, these other pagan philosophies, these secular, basically partisanship, cable news, for example, has rushed in and filled that space. That's the core problem here. The development of a civic theology on how Christ would want us to engage on social media and in politics, that's the step that has to happen to begin repairing the situation.
And I think the use of Matthew's render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's is the escape hatch for that, no?
Well, it's part of the escape hatch. I think, the point of my book is that those three core doctrines of Christianity, which map so well into the core doctrines of liberal democracy, I'm not suggesting that Christians become more progressive or liberal or conservative or democratic or Republican or secular. I am just asking the church to become more Christian. There is a word in the English language for the doctrines that we need to heal our politics in the country, and that word is Christianity. Give it a try.
Jonathan Rauch's book is Cross Purposes. John, thanks for coming on the Gabfest.
Thank you.
Let's go to cocktail chatter. Last mention of my dry January. It's my last day.
Oh my God.
Last day not drinking.
God, you're driving the rest of us to
But
drink.
now my girlfriend is proposing that we only drink on one day in February. So now I'll talk about that incessantly.
Wait, a single February or a day of the week?
Once a week. Once a week.
Okay.
Emily, what's your chatter?
I don't even know. I feel like we have not given sufficient attention to the just like dramatic conflicts of interest and financial self-servingness in this incoming administration. I am talking about the Trump and Melania meme coins, the $25 million that Meta is apparently planning to pay to Donald Trump to settle a bogus lawsuit. And I'm particularly distressed and dismayed about RFK Jr.'s refusal to give up his personal stake in lawsuits against vaccine makers, in particular the vaccine Gardasil, which protects against cervical cancer. He is about to, if he is confirmed as the head of the Department of Health and Human Services, he is about to be in charge of deciding which companies and in which terms can be sued for their vaccines. This is just a classic conflict of interest. It is only one of many reasons to question RFK Jr.'s suitability for this position. But the fact that this alone has not raised that many concerns in Congress, it's just confounding. I know that talking about norms eroding and shifting is a fool's errand at the moment, but I'm going to do it anyway. It is just remarkable.
Unbelievable. Incredible. John, what's your chatter?
I am fascinated by the discovery on the asteroid Bennu. So NASA announced Wednesday that basically it grabbed a bunch of dust from a 500 meter wide space rock, and it analyzed it and found essentially that on this asteroid were the fundamental components of proteins and DNA. And so while it doesn't indicate that there was life on the asteroid itself, it supports the theory that asteroids may have delivered, these vital ingredients to the Earth billions of years ago, potentially basically seeding, seeding, life on the planet. And now here's the fun part. If it bonked into our planet and seeded life here, surely asteroids bonked into other worlds in the solar system, assuming that they could host the kind of growth that took place for these proteins or these fundamental components on our planet. Anyway, it's really fascinating and also just very cool that they were able to scrape some stuff off of an asteroid zooming by and then analyze it. So it doesn't tell us that there is life out there other than ours, but it seems to suggest a way in which it could have happened. And I believe, but I'm not read in enough to know that this also changes a variety of theories about how life started on Earth.
In my streaming series, they bring back that little sample of dust from the asteroid, and there's actually some living organism, which then becomes a threat to all of humanity.
Oh.
That's going to be in my streaming series.
But is solved by AI.
It teams up with AI.
Yeah, okay. And opens up a smoothie shop.
But unfortunately, it opens it up too late. The smoothie
Everyone's
trend is over. It's all over. It's all frozen yogurt now.
They're like,
and,
but wait.
and they go out of business.
But wait, we made kale taste good.
What is that going to be called? It's going to be called protein powder, something like that. We'll have to workshop that title. My chatter is about a wonderful story in the New York Times by Andrew Kay about a man named Suk Kim, and it's a story that I may have even talked about in the Gabfest. Certainly, it's got a lot of attention. Suk Kim had a successful career in finance, and then decide to pursue his true love, which is flying, and in particular rescuing shelter animals and bringing them from place to place in the country, so they could getting them out of kill shelters in the South mostly and bringing them to people who are willing to adopt them elsewhere in the country. And so he, in November, had a trip where he was bringing several dogs up from Georgia or up from Virginia to New York, and his plane crashed and he was killed, and 2 of the dogs survived. And there was a lot of press about it and about his, this man who is doing this wonderful thing, but also lost his life. And it's just a really moving story about how his family has dealt with his death, about this compulsion of his, this drive of his to fly and also to rescue animals, and also about the horrific scale of animal rescue in the United States, or rather animal sheltering in the United States. There were 5.8 million animals in the shelter system that went into the shelter system in 2024. It's just a huge number of animals. And then many of these animals, of course, are killed in kill shelters, and others are adopted out. But it's just like a lot of time and energy and emotion and resource that's put into this, and feels like there ought to be a better way. But it's a really good story. We have a special sad chatter, last chatter today, or last chatter before listener chatter. Julie Hugen has been our researcher now for 2 years, Julie? 2.5 years? 2 years? Just such a wonderful colleague, has done so much great stuff with us. Also, she's a great citizen, as we've talked about. She's someone who's so involved in her community and involved in the civic infrastructure of life in her home state of Colorado, and is just a delight, and also great at research too. So many of the observations and the smart things that we have said to you over the years have come because Julie has noted them, identified them, sent them to us. And now Julie is moving on to her next activities in life. Maybe she'll mention what they are. And we have a new researcher, Emily Ditto. And we wanted to give Julie Hugen a last chatter here on the Gabfest.
Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for letting me be part of the podcast for the past couple of years. It's been great. I've learned so much. I've certainly enjoyed it. If you had asked me to do a chatter a couple weeks ago, I would have told you, I'm going to take this opportunity to reset my retirement. And I bought a Woobles kit, which is an easy way to learn how to crochet. And I was getting my watch list of shows and movies all organized, because I was going to sit in front of a screen for quite a while. And at the top of that list is currently Questlove and Oz Rodriguez recently released a documentary, 50 Years of SNL Music. Ladies and gentlemen, 50 years of SNL music. And so that had made it to the top of the list. And so I was getting ready to stream that on NBC Peacock. And then the past couple weeks happened. And my glorious thoughts of resetting my retirement have had to change, unfortunately. And I feel like death, Trump comes for us all. And I realized I basically check all the boxes. I am an Asian female who is a Harvard alumni. I became a lawyer and a judge advocate, where I served in the Air Force for over 20 years in a legal capacity. So training and applying the law of armed conflict. And at the end of my career, refining the Air Force's policies on sexual assault prevention and response. And to top things off, I am a birthright citizen. And so what that means now, at least for the coming days, weeks, and months of my retirement, is that I'm having a lot of conversations with people about the Air Force's application of the DEI order and how that affects the things that I worked on in my career. And also talking with former colleagues about how they're feeling and what they're going to do about the resignation offer. And on top of that, I live in Aurora, Colorado, and I used to be the senior lawyer at Buckley Space Force Base. And so talking with folks about what that means in terms of what is going to be happening at Buckley in the coming weeks as Operation Aurora comes to its namesake city. And one raid has already been conducted, and others are allegedly in the works, though currently delayed because of the publicity of events around this city. So, I wish I could have ended on a happy note, which I would have done a couple weeks ago. And then instead, I would just say that as I return to my listener fandom of the podcast, I'll certainly be busy and needing to continue to keep up with all the things you guys are talking about.
Julie, thank you so much. And we, of course, wish you the best of luck and look forward to hearing about what comes next.
Yeah. And I would just adding to that, Julie, I think, look, I'm sorry to lose you as our researcher, but I think people are looking for ways to try to be productive and to find meaning in a time of political uncertainty. And it's really impressive how you are looking for that and how you're finding some new way to do it. One way you've done it is by helping us on the Gabfest, but here's a new way that will be really valuable to your colleagues and your former colleagues in the Air Force and your neighbors. So thank you for doing that. Listeners, you also have chatters, probably not as good as Julie's one, not as heartfelt and important as Julie's.
Hard to follow.
That's hard to follow, but sorry. You usually, if you send us a listener chatter by emailing to us at gabfest@slate.com, you will not have to follow Julie. I promise that will never happen again. However, our listener chatter this week does follow Julie. That's from David Malbin in Austin, Texas.
Hey, Slate Political Gabfest. I would like to submit a listener chatter highly recommending You Will Not Recognize Your Life, written and performed by Michaela Bly. This Audible original is under 3 hours in length. It's free if you are an Audible member. It is funny. It is vulnerable. It's a look back at the early aughts with many funny, poignant social observations. It engages topics of chronic disease, dating, love, and the masks we wear. Highly recommend. I think you, as hosts, and many of your listeners will enjoy. Thanks for all you do.
That's all for our episode this week. We also have a bonus episode in your feed. We're going to talk about the ongoing decline in test scores for public school kids and how those can be turned around, how they could possibly even become a unifying, non-partisan political issue. That, however, is only for Slate Plus members. Slate Plus members get bonus episodes every week, as well as discounts to our live shows. They don't hit the paywall on the Slate site, much more. And if you are a member, we really appreciate it. Thank you. Please enjoy that episode. If you're not a member, you can subscribe to Slate Plus directly from the Political Gabfest show page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or visit slate.com/Gabfest Plus to get access wherever you listen. That's our show for today. Our researcher has been Julie Hugan. Our new researcher is Emily Ditto. Our theme music is by They Might Be Giants. Ben Richmond is Senior Director for Podcast Operations. Emily Bazelon and John Dickerson. I'm David Plotz. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next week.